Welcome back, everybody, to the latest edition of the Bookworm Mom. Today, we're going to continue with the series we started last time with the author Cleon Skousen, who is the author of several fantastic books. Last time, we did The 5,000-Year Leap, and today we are going to dive into the book The Naked Communist. Now, for those of you who think, well, the naked communist just sounds scandalous. Well, it doesn't mean what you think it means.
Yeah, I don't think I want to see Karl Marx walking around in skivvies.
Or Frederick Engels either. Yeah, exactly. No, it just basically is similar to saying the unvarnished truth about communism. There's nothing hiding it. There's no pretenses there. This is the unvarnished truth about communism from the eyes of Mr. Skousen. Now, this book was written originally and published in 1958, so it's even older than the previous book I mentioned, but the initial writing of the book was not really so much for public consumption as it was for the FBI and for sort of interdepartmental training that they did. So it was a very significant book, and is still a significant book in the FBI, and obviously probably one of the premier sources if you want to talk about knowledge of communism and how it affects the United States. And again, we know in the 50s what was going on, the Red Scare, all of that. So, but to kind of bring it up to speed in terms of the latest addition to this book was done in 2017. Now, some people, if you remember last time, I told you that Mr. Skousen passed away in 2006. No, he did not come back from the grave. We don't have a ghost writing. I mean, that gives a whole new meaning to ghost writing, doesn't it? No, it was his son, Paul, who added the commentary in 2017. But I want to read a quick quote here from July of 2014. It is from the noted surgeon and political commentator, Dr. Ben Carson, who famously ran for president. He appeared on Fox News and had the following to say about The Naked Communist. He said, "The Naked Communist lays out the whole progressive agenda. You would think by reading it that it was written last year. It shows what the progressives are trying to do to the American family and what they are trying to do to destroy our Judeo-Christian values and morality." End quote. So, that just, I want to impress upon you that, yes, this book was written quite a long time ago, well before I was born. I was born in 1970, so well before I was born. But this is the book I mentioned last time as well, that I was reading it on the Kindle in Italy, and my husband was ready to go to the wine tasting, and I said, one more chapter. I want to read a couple more pages here. And so it's really, because as you're reading it, again, it's another one of those books where you're like, oh my gosh, this is literally happening right now. This is like, did they write this yesterday? And it's just amazing.
Yeah.
So it's broken down into basically two parts, how he did it. So the first half of the book, if you will, or the first part of the book, is basically designed to deal with the threat of communism. And for those of you who are in the Horry County area, you may remember back in 2020 when we had the big race for replacing Tom Rice because of his treacherous actions towards Trump when he voted to impeach him. And so that led to the replacement of Mr. Rice with now our current Congressman Russell Fry. But at the time, I think there were 7 or 8 people. There was another doctor. Barbara Arthur was running. Ken Richardson was running. A number of people had gotten into that race to try and replace Tom Rice, which speaks to the success that Russell had in not having to go to a runoff. He won that outright in the primary, which is pretty impressive. It didn't hurt him that he had a huge endorsement from President Trump, and Trump actually came to South Carolina and did this big rally down in Florence, so that helped him. But anyway, I bring that up because one of the folks running, Barbara Arthur, whose name I mentioned, she talked quite a bit about the threat of communism, and a lot of people, myself included, sort of were dismissive towards her about that. But then I started doing some digging and some research, and wow, she was not wrong. And I think when you look at what happened shortly thereafter with COVID and all of the lockdowns, and then you had a young lady by the name of Xi Van Fleet, a Chinese lady who escaped from China and was up in Loudoun County, Virginia, and said, listen, I know what this is. This is cultural Marxism, and that's when the schools were having to teach online, and parents were finding out what their kids were learning.
Yeah.
And much of it was, indeed, cultural Marxism. And so it's just really fascinating. So that led me down this path, and that's how I led to this book. And so I wanted to share it with you to let folks know you need to read this book if you haven't. And it reads well. It's not difficult to read. It is a thicker book as you're sitting here looking at it. But a lot of that is also citations, and there's some commentary and other things. But the meat of the book is fantastic to read. So, again, starts off, does an introduction, talks about the rise of the Marxist man. And, of course, it's called Marxism because it's named after Karl Marx, one of its founders. Although many argue that really it was Frederick Engels who did the lion's share of the work. Yeah. Marx just got the credit for it. Chapter 1 talks about the founders again, so it's going to talk about both Marx and Engels. And you have some other works like the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, which, of course, are significant books in the communist world. It also talks about the 6 core principles from the manifesto, which include overthrow of capitalism, abolition of private property, which in some sense, we talked about that last time, that you really don't own private property if the government can tax it, and if you don't pay the taxes, they can take it from you. Then you really are renting it from the government. But anyway, that's another discussion. Elimination of the family, abolition of classes, overthrow of governments, and establishment of communal ownership. So everybody owns everything in this classless society. We all sing Kumbaya around the campfire. Kumbaya, my Lord. Chapter 2 goes
more.
Right, pass us some more. Oh, no, you've had more than your share.
There we go.
You've had too much. The appeal of communism is kind of talked about in Chapter 2. What makes people want to be a communist? And I've often thought, how can anybody want to be a part of this nonsense? But then you see this youthful exuberance for it all the time because they think free stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at Mondami up there in New York City, free bus rides, free, all free. And
child care. And,
there's no such thing as free. I mean, come on, buddy. Again, core principle that I learned in economics when I was in high school back in the 80s, there's no such thing as a free lunch because somebody somewhere is paying for that lunch. It is not poof out of nowhere. But they kind of break it down, and they talk about why people say, communism is in fact the best, proven system of government. They even talk about, or he even talks about how there's arguments that Christianity had the first form of communism until you get into the nuances of the verses and you realize, Paul and Ananias, probably not Ananias and Sapphira, really were not communist, and Paul makes it clear that they didn't have to give their stuff. They chose to, and then they chose to be deceptive about it. And he even says, was this not your property? Of course, yes. Did you have the right to keep it or sell it as you chose? Well, yes, you did. Did you have the right to keep all of the money from the proceeds? Why, yes, you did. But you chose to lie about what you gave, and so that was the quote-unquote sin against, God. Anyway, chapter 3 talks about the communist approach to the solution of all the world's problems, which, they say things like it covers the theories on private property, the origin of the state as a tool of the ruling class. Okay, that's where that comes from. The proletariat, the bourgeoisie, religion, which of course they call the opium of the people because we need to have something to get us through our day. We have to have some higher being. I've heard it referred to as a crutch as well. Then he goes on to the morals, relative and class-based. And then a plan of action, proletarian revolution, which leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat and eventual withering away of the state into a classless, stateless, communist society. And if you look at the examples, the very first communist country was the United States, the USSR, former Soviet Republic. And of course, it was very successful. Oh, no, wait, it wasn't successful. So, what happened there? Hang on a second, folks. And then chapter 4 switches into a brief critique of the communist approach to the world problems. He does a point-by-point rebuttal and argues, communism arose as a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution's problems, but, they were misdiagnosed. He critiques the view of history, society, the state, religion, and morals as overly negative and deterministic, and that's how the communists look at it, and calls dictatorship of the proletariat and stateless utopia unrealistic and a negative approach that destroys rather than builds. And the evidence abounds for that. I mean, you can look at Cuba. Things are not going well over there. They don't have power. Look at Vietnam. Look at North Korea. Again, look at the former Soviet Union. We call it former for a reason. It doesn't exist anymore. There can be arguments made about whether or not it's truly a democratic system that they have in Russia now. I mean, they hold elections, if you will, but it's kind of like they also hold elections in North Korea. It's one person on the ballot, but hey,
Right.
He only got 98% of the vote last time, something like, and he didn't get 100%, and I thought,
like 99.8.
I paid a fool that didn't vote for that guy. He's not with us anymore.
Trump got 100% MAGA support for
exactly right, 100%. Oh my gosh! Going into chapter 5, he talks about the rise of the revolutionary movement in Russia, which traces obviously its Marxist arrival into Russia, the early life of course, Lenin, and then the split between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, and of course you have Lenin and Stalin, and that takes place in chapter 6, how Russia became the communist world power, and they were considered a superpower along with the United States. Their civil war, the war of communism, the NEP, the 5-year plans, the purges, collectivization, and their emergence as that superpower I mentioned. But he also highlights in that chapter the cost of human life and the totalitarian methods. If you think about Stalin and the gulags, that comes into, again, Solzhenitsyn's book, the Gulag Archipelago. So you need to read that book to understand what it was like if you spoke out in any way. In fact, he didn't really speak out. He wrote a letter while he was stationed in combat, and they took the letter and took something he said, and from my mind, the way I've read it, it was rather taken out of context, but that landed him in prison, but not just a prison, in the gulag. And pretty much you could be executed, or you could die of starvation, or they work you to death. So, I mean, the fact that he survived in and of itself is a miracle. And also, what an awesome experience it was to have survived long enough to see that collapse and be able to return to your homeland and see some of the perestroika that had taken place. So pretty exciting there. He goes on to chapter 7. He talks about communism in the United States, discusses the communist infiltration in front organizations, espionage, spy, of course, again, FBI, the influence in labor unions. That's probably what happened to that guy that's been missing forever, the big labor union guy. You know what I'm talking about? What was his name? Forgive me. We'll come to it later. But their influence, communist influence in government, in education, and the culture during the early to mid 20th century. He references FBI knowledge and specific cases of subversion that he actually worked on himself. And again, I'm sure that's going to take you into the discussion about what took place in Hollywood and why he was taken or moved out there to deal with the communist threat. Chapter 8 then talks about communism and World War II, examining the Nazi-Soviet pact, the Soviet expansion during and, of course, after the war, alliances of convenience, and how the West wartime cooperation aided communist gains in Eastern Europe as well as elsewhere. You remember the domino effect? If Vietnam falls and that kind of came Laos, that happened. That came to fruition. They did fall, and they are still currently communist. Chapter 9 goes into communist attacks on the free world after World War II. It details post-war aggression, the Iron Curtain. Little side note, I was in 5th grade, 10 years old, and I remember my social studies teacher rather, talking about the Iron Curtain. And at age 10, you're still kind of concrete thinkers. You really can't think in the abstract. And so I remember sitting in the class as she talked about this Iron Curtain descending around the Soviet Union and going through Berlin and separating East and West Berlin. And my little 10-year-old mind was like, well, doesn't it rust when it rains? I'm picturing a literal iron curtain descending, because she said there was a literal wall built, so I assumed it was an iron curtain. But so it's funny. Now that I'm a teacher, I understand that probably wasn't the correct training teaching. She probably should have explained it a little bit clearer, because we weren't yet all some were. Some advanced people got it, but myself, I was there thinking, that's going to rust. I have to sand that a lot.
That's a lot of iron.
I know, and then, of course, the Korean War, support for insurgencies and efforts to expand influence across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I talked about that in the very first episode, when we did the book by Peter Schweitzer, the Invisible Coup, and he talked about how each of the various Latin American countries had fallen to the communist influence or democratic socialism, whatever you want to call it. It's communism. That's really what it is.
Right.
Marxism. He then argues that they follow a timetable of conquest, Asia first, then Africa, Europe, then America. Thankfully, we haven't fallen yet, but we have some issues. And then chapter 10, he talks about communism under Khrushchev, the squish us like a bug guy. I squish you under my shoe like a bug. He analyzes the de-Stalinization, peaceful coexistence, rhetoric as a tactic, the continued subversion, and events like the Hungarian uprising, suppression, and his views as strategic softening rather than genuine reform. Chapter 11 then goes into the fall of Cuba or Latin America. He focuses on Fidel Castro's revolution and how Cuba became a Soviet satellite, and warns of communist penetration into the Western Hemisphere, which all of those things obviously transpired. They did happen, and they are still happening.
Yeah.
Trump has been pushing back on that, but currently he's kind of refocused himself with this Iranian war, so we'll see if he adjusts and returns back to our hemisphere at the conclusion, which from the speech on Thursday, 2 to 3 weeks from now should be occurring. Chapter 12, The Future Task, or What the West Can Do, outlines the West's challenges and rejects coexistence as surrender. It kind of makes me think of tolerance. The left always says, you need to be more tolerant.
Oh, yeah.
But it goes one way with them.
Exactly.
We have to be tolerant of their views and beliefs. They do not have to be tolerant of our views and beliefs. So same thing with these.
Saul Alinsky.
Yeah, same thing with this coexistence nonsense. We have to coexist with them. They do not have to coexist with us. And
right.
Which is why you've seen talking heads on the TV say that when we get Trump out, these people need to be deprogrammed. They've been brainwashed in the MAGA movement, and we need to send them to training camps. I'm thinking, do you hear yourself talking? Holy cow. Anyway, so he calls for a positive strategy to win the Cold War. Now, yes, of course, the Cold War's over, but again, he's doing this from a history standpoint. And when he wrote this book in '58, Cold War was very much in play. It was not something that was a past tense. And he discusses how we could end it without having a major hot war. He includes practical sections, instructions, and suggestions for parents, teachers, and students, even businessmen and legislatures, as well as the press and ministers. And he ends the chapter with some optimism that the West can win by understanding and countering communism while strengthening free institutions, something that we have failed to do.
Yeah.
And, I could go into a whole other section about how the educational leaders then took this communist manifesto and twisted it into an education manifesto that basically mirrors almost identically the same views and philosophies shared by the communist Marxist manifesto. Yeah. Then we go into part 2, and there are some additional sections depending on which edition that you have. These follow the historical narrative, and they include things like the 5 vital questions. Defenses of communism, they get answered because people say, but communism does this, and then he kind of answers why that's not accurate. How to build a free nation, what free enterprise capitalism really is, and whether early Christians did in fact practice communism. Obviously, Skousen argues no. And the secret weapon of communism, often identified as its ideological appeal combined with subversion and patience, which, again, rules for radicals, kind of lays out exactly how this takes place. And, if you go out and tell people, again, I go to the mayor of New York, you go out and tell people, I'm going to give you free bus rides and free, rent-free places to live and free food. And they had the grocery store, which I don't even think that made it 3 days, and it collapsed. Wonder why. Can't imagine. And then he talks about the 45 communist goals. I'm going to read a few of those to you. And pretty interesting stuff. But before we get to that, I kind of, as you know, my book, me and my porcupine books, gotta do things.
It does all the little pretty pink and
pink and yellow and green and blue and orange. It's so pretty. That's the mom part of me. Got to be neat. But what Marxists actually want. And so Here's a line from the book that I thought kind of helped to summarize that. All Marxists fervently hope that the new society will produce the changes in human nature which are necessary before full communism can become a reality. Individuals must forget that there was ever a time when income could be secured from the mere ownership of property or from productive labor. In other words, wages will be abolished. Oh, it's great. We'll all just work because we love each other. And that's been very successfully tried. It's not been successfully accomplished, but it's been tried.
Yep.
So when they talk about the communist goals, the 45 communist goals, which, by the way, were read into the congressional record in 1963, so it's a permanent record. Now, there are people who argue that these goals are, nowhere written anywhere by any communist group or entity. Mm-hmm. But
they're so transparent anyway.
You're right, yes. And they just will share with you openly all of their plans. No problem with that. So number one was the U.S. acceptance of coexistence as the only alternative to atomic war. So we have to coexist so that we don't end up in atomic war. That was kind of one of the first things, which they did accomplish that because we have MAD, mutually assured destruction. So everybody with a nuclear weapon at this point in time knows if they use it against somebody else that it's not going to end well for them either.
Yeah.
Number two, the U.S. willingness to capitulate in preference to engaging in nuclear war. So they would rather the United States surrender than engage in a nuclear war. Develop the illusion that the total disarmament of the United States would be a demonstration of moral strength, which reminds me of, we always are the first to say, okay, we'll give up this many nukes. And then the Russians would say, well, we'll give up this many, half of what you give up.
Yeah.
And then we say, okay, can we check that? We tell you, we're done. You believe. But we
Moose
check
and
you.
Squirrel.
Yes, Moose and Squirrel say it's done. And then you have permit-free trade between all nations, extension of long-term loans to Russia and Soviet satellites, which this is where we started giving away money. Hey, you want some money? Okay, we'll give you some. Just don't be communist. Then it was number 7, which we've obviously done, grant recognition of Red China and admit Red China into the UN. Not only did we let them into the UN, but they're one of the 5 members of the Security Council. And then we put them in the World Economic Forum. And it's just like, what are we doing? Anyway, we set up the East and West Germany as separate states in spite of Khrushchev's promise in 1955 that he was going to settle it and all of that. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And the bottom line is, in 2017, when Paul writes his commentary addition to the book, he surmises that all 44 of 45 objectives have been achieved. And some of those include things like emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of their parents.
Yeah.
What? Mm-hmm. Create the impression that violence and insurrection are legitimate aspects of American tradition and that students and special interest groups should rise up and use united force to solve economic, political, and social problems, like with mostly peaceful protest. Yeah. Internationalize the Panama Canal, which that occurred under Jimmy Carter. It started in 1977, and I think it was finalized in 1999. Now, again, Trump has pushed back on that a little bit and kind of pushed out a lot of the Chinese influence, for example, has been pushed out. They want to eliminate laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. That's been done.
Yeah.
Break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. I mean, who would have ever guessed some of the books that we have in the classrooms that young kids are allowed to have access to read?
Right.
It's just pornography.
And yet Chinese TikTok doesn't allow anything.
Nothing.
Except for classical music.
Correct. Present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. Cut your body parts off and be whatever you want. Infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a, quote, religious crutch. Discredit the American Constitution by calling it inadequate, old-fashioned, out of step with modern needs, a hindrance to cooperation between nations on a world basis. Discredit the American Founding Fathers, present them as selfish aristocrats who had no concern for the common man. And it just, it goes on and on and on and on. One of the ones I thought was interesting was it said discredit and eventually dismantle the FBI. I mean, we've definitely discredited the FBI. The last administration certainly did. And this current one has not. It hasn't shined it back up yet.
No.
But it didn't dismantle it totally. We still have it. The only one that has not, in some way, shape, or form, according to Paul Skousen, been completed is the 45th, which is the repeal of the colony reservation, so that the United States cannot prevent the World Court from seizing jurisdiction over domestic problems. So if you do something, the World Court can't come in and try you for it. Only, a court in the United States can try you for that.
Right.
So I don't ever want to see that get changed. So we kind of talked a little bit about the Panama Canal and the fact that Trump has pushed back against the control of communist China.
Right.
And that's a good thing, because if we were to go to war, you don't want to have a communist nation saying, nope, you can't use the Panama Canal. You're going to have to go around. That's not a sure thing. I mean, we're seeing how important straits and canals can be right now with the Straits of Hormuz being shut down. It definitely impacts us. He does some things in here, what do defenders of communism say? And so then he gives an example of, here's a student that says, well, what is the communist attitude towards the Bible, which contains many moral teachings? And then he responds with a collection of fantastic legends without any scientific support. It is full of dark hints, historical mistakes, and contradictions. It serves as a factor for gaining power and subjugating the unknowing nations. And that's kind of the official statement of the communist. And then Engels' statement on that is, it is now perfectly clear to me that the so-called sacred writings of the Jews are nothing more than the record of the old Arabian religious and tribal traditions, modified by the early separation of the Jews from their tribally related but nomadic neighbors. So yeah, they're also biblical scholars. They are. Yeah, they know the Torah. They know it all. It's pretty impressive. And then the book it does end with, there's hope. And he kind of goes into the breakdown of what are the successful things that capitalism has given us. And just quickly, capitalism is by far the best known system to provide for the physical needs of man, permits man to satisfy his spiritual needs, allows for variation as between individuals, is naturally self-expanding, which tends to create strong economic ties between communities, states, and nations, allows for the freedom to sell, freedom to try, freedom to buy, which, last time when Trump was in, I remember there were a lot of people that wanted to try ivermectin for the COVID treatment, and that was prevented. And so he had famously put through some legislation that said people should have the right to try. If you are terminally ill and you want to try an experimental drug or an experimental treatment of some sort, the medical FDA should not be able to say, nope, we're not letting you do it because it's experimental. I mean, they're dying.
All right.
They should have the right to try. It is their right as a person to try to save their lives. I mean, to me, it seems crazy that we are more restrictive to try and stop people from saving their lives than we are up in Canada, where they're like, oh, you want to commit suicide? Okay, great, come this way.
Yeah.
We'll help you. I saw a story not too long ago. 85-year-old lady had pulled a muscle, hurt her back, got up out of bed. And so she goes in to see the doctor about what she'd done and how she could get it treated. And she's immediately met with one of they call them maids, which I'm assuming stands for some sort of mutually assisted death or whatever.
Yeah.
And the lady's like, are you interested in suicide? We can help you with that. And she's like, no, I'm here to have a pulled muscle. What? No. Yeah. And so she didn't do it, obviously. And she goes on and she's talked about all the places she'd traveled. She'd gone to like 4 other countries after that. Again, she's 85, but she looked healthy, looked fine. And so, again, we should have the right to try to live, not to kill themselves. But capitalism also increases the wages of workers in relation to prices, reduces the hours of work necessary to make a living. And we think about, we have the 40-hour work week now, and we have a minimum wage, all of these things that, to some sense, isn't true, is not free market. But anyway, that's a discussion for another day. And capitalism is providing the most effective means mankind has yet discovered for sharing the wealth. Now, what's interesting about that is, of course, spread the wealth and sharing the wealth, two different things. I think one of the things that we're seeing now habitually is all of these NGOs, USAID, et cetera, being given billions of dollars. that, in my estimation, was the democratic, socialist, the communist movement to spread the wealth around. Take money from the wealthier folks and give it to others. Elizabeth Warren she just posted this, that if we took like $7 billion from Jeff Bezos, that she could pay off this thing and give, food to these kids in schools and cover it, and he'd still have $220 billion left over. And somebody else said, you're not getting anybody else's money. You don't even use the money we grant you now wisely. Yeah. And my response was, how about you stop the billions of dollars in graft, fraud, and corruption and use that money that you've already been given to deal with those problems?
Yeah, because Mr. Bezos is investing in our future. You're just trying to take it away and waste it on some more of the things from the past. Yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of summarizes The Naked Communist.
That's amazing.
So it's a really good book. And so the last book we'll do in the series on Mr. Skousen is going to be his book, The Naked Capitalist. So that'll be next. But I do have some exciting news.
Ooh.
Yeah, we have there's a brand new book coming out. It's scheduled for release on May 12th. It is called The Generosity of Scars, and it is written by a man who, is a retired GWAT Global War on Terror veteran, Lieutenant Colonel in Green Beret, Mr. Scott Mann.
Scott Mann, okay.
And he's written several of the books, like 33 other books. No One's Coming to Save You. Probably one of the things he's most famous for is the Pineapple Express, where they were helping get Americans and our allies out of Afghanistan after that debacle of a collapse that was led by the Biden regime. So that's kind of where I came to know him. But he has agreed to come on and talk about his new book.
Awesome.
So totally excited about it. Just kind of waiting to see what is the best date in his calendar for that to occur. So really, folks, if you need to start listening in. You can find Scott. He does his own podcast as well. And he's been on the Sean Ryan Show. Gary Sinise has worked with him on the play he did, Ulysses of a Green Beret. He's just a great guy. He really is. Fantastic. So I'm very excited about that. It's big news for the pod. And I told him, look, I don't have a tremendous following on this pod or any of the apps that we use, but
But it's growing fast.
It's growing, and Scott's such a humble guy that he was like, yeah, sure, I'll come do it. Wow. So exciting news. So please stay tuned. And again, like us, share us. It doesn't cost anything for you to subscribe. I'm not charging you. And talk to other folks, tell them about the podcast, and send us your suggestions for other books that I could pick up and read. And,
absolutely. And
as always, go on and check out the other podcasts. There are lots of other good ones out there.
Yeah, go to libertycrackmedia.com. And, you and Conversations with the Hoff, Steve Hoffman, are bringing in all these nationally known people. This is fantastic. Yep. We really love it. And I'm excited. I hope everybody tunes in. We drop the podcast every Friday. And stay tuned for more of The Bookworm Mom.